Working with floats and positioning elements on our web pages with CSS is something that is exciting and often exceptionally frustrating. It's enough to make people want to throw things at their computer screen, to use bad language, talk like a pirate, and all kinds of other inappropriate behaviors and actions. So in this document, which I will be providing to you a little bit later, I've used my little trick of putting a border on everything and then adding colors to each of the elements on my document so that I can understand what is exactly what when I look at my page. So on this, I have a series of 4 divs, and I have some leftover stuff from demonstrating earlier. So each of these divs have a class associated with them. Those classes are simply providing colors. Now, if I look at a div just has a width, it has a height, it has a background color attached to it. Now we can't see that background color because the div's color is overriding that color. So if I were to remove this class and save this, we'll see that we now see the gray div color showing through. So we can see the background color if the div is there, but then when I put the class on it, it does change it. So our main document, the HTML, gets a background of gray. So we can see the gray. The body gets a background of white. The div gets a background of a lighter gray. The paragraphs get a background of pale green. When I look at my page, I will see that there is default padding occurring on my page because I have this extra spacing occurring around my elements. One of the first things that we want to do whenever we are trying to construct layout on a page is to make sure that everything we are working with has its default or inherent margin and padding removed. Because if we don't do that, we will often find that elements are positioning themselves on screen and they're real close to where we want them to be, but they're off by approximately about 10 pixels on a regular basis. And it's enough to drive you nuts when you keep putting in numbers and things aren't lining up how you want, they're not sizing how you want, and it drives you absolutely batty. So my recommended plan is to first zero out the margin and padding on everything. Now, there are what are called normalizers. These are CSS rules that you can add to your page, and they do more than just remove margin and padding, but they do perform a number of other things to kind of get your page prepped so that all of the default formatting has been removed. So any formatting that does show is based on choices that you have made, because then constructing your page becomes much more predictable. So if I zero that out, we can see how the extra space disappeared. Everything is now tied up in the left corner. We don't get to see that inherent padding anymore, and everything is in a much better position to begin with. Now, my paragraphs, as I look at these paragraphs, I will see that as they exist on my page, that they have some issues with, I don't want it just to be one line, but I want it to fill all of my page. So to do that, I can now fill them by giving them a height and a width of 100. Now if we add in margin or padding, we'll see how other things change within our page. I'm going to comment that out. But if I forget to zero out the margin and padding for every element on my page, you'll notice how this paragraph has been pushed down because we're seeing some color, but also how it's extending beyond the box because it's extending outside of the blue box, outside of each element. It's moving itself down. I changed my background color to an RGBA value so I can use alpha or transparency. Remembering that CSS colors, we have our RGB values, which are 0 to 255. Transparency is going to be 0 to 1. 1 is opaque, 0 is transparent. So by setting that value, I can see it very specifically on my yellow where it extends beyond the box. And we can see that line extending out. So the first order of business whenever we are trying to control the layout for any given web page is you will want to zero everything. And once we zero everything, at that point, we can finally start positioning the elements on the screen. There is a script called Normalize. Not a script, it's a CSS file. It's on GitHub, so I want to call it a script. But it's a CSS file. And it helps to standardize the appearance of text, zeros your margins, some other display issues, to try and give you a consistent starting point so that everything you do after this will often just make more sense in your code. So even if you never look at this, you just load Normalize as part of your page. That being said, if you get your page to work without it, then there's no reason to use it, because that requires you to ask your users to download more content. But a lot of these things, as we look at what is contained inside of Normalize, are addressing quirks of how browsers display content. And Normalize attempts to remedy that to make your life easier. CSS can be your friend. There are other libraries out there that can perform similar operations, but they're all doing this same kind of task, which is to make your document behave in the way that you would expect it to behave. The simple version for now, and that we will be using, will simply be to use the wildcard. Margin 0, padding 0. We leave the border on so we can see where elements are being drawn on screen. It helps us to better understand what is happening with our project. So if I turn off height and width on my divs, we'll see, okay, now my divs occupy that much of the screen. Inside of our document, we have something referred to as our document flow. The document flow is how elements show up on screen. And currently, these elements, as they are showing up on screen, we can see I have red, green, blue, and yellow. I'm just going to tone down the paragraph sizing a little bit so that we can see the colors a little bit easier of those boxes. Now, these boxes are displaying in the order that they appear in the markup. So red, green, blue, yellow. this is the flow of the document. When we start floating elements, we are starting to move them outside of the regular document flow. And it starts to change how the document will render. So if I add a class of float right to my green box, we'll notice that the green box moved over and the blue box slid up to take its place. Because by floating the green box, we've effectively pulled it loose from the flow of the document, leaving a hole for the blue to fill. So when we start floating elements on our web pages, and this is where it actually can be useful, if we move our web page changes size, that element moves across the screen. So we've positioned it by telling it to float right, so let's say pull it out of the document flow and jam it against the right margin. But we will also notice that it lines up with where it was before. So the top section of the document where red is, nothing is floating before that, so because of that, the green box starts on the next line. So it's as if there's a line return at the end of red, and then green moves over, and then that left a hole for blue to fill. Now, things are getting a little bit tricky here because I told my red box to float left, my green box to float right, and I don't see my blue box anymore. And the yellow box is now on top of the blue box. Wait, so now we float red left, green right, blue right, but now blue is between red and green, and yellow just disappeared underneath. By adding in the clear class, we're able to effectively say this element and all elements that follow no longer will be affected by any floats that happened prior.
So you can do it after and before.
Use float clear, or clear. In this case, I'm using clear both. So not float, but clear, which really it should be, it'd almost be nice if it was still float and then you'd have clear left, clear right, or clear both as your options. That would make more sense from a CSS standpoint because that's what it's being used to do. So clear is allowing me to resume a normal document flow so that I am no longer floating. So if I even had on the blue, I put clear there. We'll see how now red's here, green's there, blue is underneath, yellow is underneath that. Now under yellow, if I said float right, we'll see how yellow goes off to the right.
Yeah, but it takes the rest of the bottom of the page.
Using the ClearFix hack of overflow auto as a way to rectify our situation, put directly on the body tag, which was showing so the body tag with the white background, overflow auto is not able to respond correctly on the body tag. But if we choose a block level element that we can work with, such as adding in a containing element like the main tag, which would traditionally be part of a main section of content where we are experiencing this, or a section tag, or an article tag, or some other block level element, when we do that, we can add in overflow auto, and that allows us to clean up the page. Using an additional structural piece of markup allows us to target it more directly. We're able to then put on overflow auto, which then gives us the ability to flesh out the background.